You're listening to part 2 of a Dear Applicants podcast episode. Check out last week's episode to listen to part 1 of this interview. Well, we already talked a little bit about the social element, but how did you find those friends in the first place? Did you put yourself, were there certain socials? Were there, gatherings where you got to know these people?
I think just kind of being open to wanting to go socialize. So I know like some Asian friends, they were very shy to participate in events or someone organized a party and then they're like, oh, don't really want to go. And, but I really put myself out there. So, just go and just start taking the initiative to approach people. I know it can be quite scary for some people, especially if you're an introvert, but Jonathan, I don't think you're an introvert.
Deeply introvert.
So thankfully, I think I'm a bit more daring, I'd say. So I just really went and made friends, and I think just being very open to wanting to expand that social circle can really go a long way. And I'll say it's more difficult to make friends later on because you have to do it quite quick.
Early on, while everyone is in that sort of like, oh, I need friends kind of mood,
once everyone formed their groups, it's really hard
to
get into the groups. So that's what I did. I entered the groups by taking the initiative to do that.
And how did you deal with the weather? Because that must have been a massive change. I mean, I've heard from friends that moved from, they were in Yale and US with me for 4 years and they worked for 7 years in Singapore, used to this weather, had grown up in India, in the south, where it's relatively warm. And then they suddenly end up in the UK and have to deal with the UK winters. And I get calls going, what's going on? And it's just dark all the time. It's wet.
That's honestly something I struggle the most with living in the UK. I mean, I'm a true Singaporean, and I lived in a sunny weather for 20 years of my life, and I'm thrown into this weather that's so unpredictable. I would say you can never get used to the weather, and
so you're still not used to it?
I still can't get used to winter, and sometimes you get winter for like 4 months or more if you're unlucky that year. And I think there were times that I felt depressed because of the lack of daylight. And I think we kind of take it for granted in Singapore, right? Because you always get such good weather.
Well, everyone's cursing the weather, right?
I know Singaporeans go like, no, it's too hot. But hey, it's great. And you can really tell how weather affects people. So when it's, it's like there's no sun, it's raining all the time, it's cold, people get a bit more grumpy. And then when the sun is out, it makes a huge difference. Everyone is in a good mood and everyone's happy. And
everyone's out in the parks having picnics.
And then initially I was like, oh my God, like everyone's just camping out on the grass. Any patch of grass you can find. People are just sitting, lying there and just enjoying the sun and the weather. So it's just really interesting.
I think I caught London in a good phase, at least for me, because it was a strangely warm September, right, when I visited, and I was walking around very happily, just strolling all over the place.
Everyone was so
everyone
pleased.
else was sweating and like suffering, and I was just sitting there like,
everyone was so pleased with it because, it felt like summer extended a little bit more. And and
I remember you had asked, when I told you I was visiting the UK, you were like, oh, why don't you visit in October or November? And I was like, there's no way I'm dealing with that cold. It's like, if I go, it's going to be nice and warm and palatable.
And then I remember you brought 3 layers of jackets.
I did.
When you came.
I did. Was I wearing 3 layers when I met you?
No, you had it in your bag.
I had it in my bag. Always prepared, right? There were actually, there were 3 layers. And I used all of them when I went to Edinburgh. Because I walked out of the train and I was like, and I'd already put on a few layers before I got off the train. I stepped out and I was like, oh. Like I hadn't been that cold since 2019, like in Jordan or something, where I was like freezing in December.
You need to come during the winter.
No, I think I will. I think I'll pass. But even Edinburgh, people were walking around in shorts and a t-shirt, and I was there huddled up in 4 layers with a scarf. It was.
But hey, there's some things that really, is good during the winter, like counting down to Christmas. The winter is very magical. like you go to Christmas markets, you have all these beautiful lights everywhere. You hold a cup of mulled wine.
And that's the Christmas you grew up with in the movies and stuff like that, right? I have always wanted a white Christmas, I have to say.
Yeah, you should visit then.
One day.
So there's some good things, but it does get a bit depressing after Christmas. And you're just hoping spring would come really soon.
Yeah, maybe just a week-long visit for Christmas and then run away. But yeah, well, the food is also something that a lot of people ask about, right? And
Yeah.
I know, well, I have my own thoughts on the food, but I know you believe that there's certain misconceptions. When I visited, and another colleague of mine visited, and you had offered to take us out for British fare, and we sort of turned our noses up at you and said, what even is that? And fish and chips. And you feel differently.
Well, I think actually some people like, oh, what do I eat in the UK? And people think, oh, it's fish and chips. Well, I'd say maybe it was that some time ago, but of course, fish and chips is like an iconic British
It's also
dish.
one of like 4 things in every pub, right? Like fish and
Yeah,
chips,
I mean,
pie. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Bangers and mash.
Bangers and mash, yeah.
So yeah, I mean the UK did do fantastic fish and chips, but I would say that over time, or at least in London, I would say the variety of food has really grown, and everyone is very, much more adventurous in, the food that they consume, and there's so many options now in London. So it's not just fish and chips, if that makes sense.
What kind of food do you enjoy when you're there? When you're not cooking?
Okay. I love just exploring new food. So, like there are restaurants popping up like Caribbean, Greek, Indian. Of course, there are lots of Asian options as well. Actually, there are really good British restaurants, and we went to one of them. We went to one of them, and I mean, it was great. It wasn't not fish and chips, and it was great.
And I was kicking myself afterwards because we didn't go to Dishum. I really wanted to go. And then the next day I had met a friend, and she was like, oh, have you not been to Dishum? How could you not go? And so we walked, and there was a line out the door for like 100 meters down the road. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's not happening.
Yeah, I did offer you to go to Dishum.
And I was like, oh, I've come all the way from Singapore and grown up in India. I don't need Indian food anymore.
So having said all that, did you know that the Brits have voted the national dish to be chicken tikka masala?
Yeah, but that was a while ago, right? I mean, it's something I grew up with, I think. My parents would always tell me, it's like, oh, yeah,
But this is not anyone would have expected, right? I mean, Indian dish as a UK national dish.
The thing is, I don't even, and I could be very wrong and get slammed for this later, but I don't even think chicken tikka masala, the masala being with the curry, is an Indian dish. I think chicken tikka is, right? It's a tandoori dish. But I think the whole masala thing was dreamt up in Scotland or something. I don't know.
I didn't know that.
I feel as though this might just be something my dad told me, and it's one of those things I heard as a kid and I took as gospel. But yeah, I mean, there's always funny stuff with food, right? Like our producer, Bolun, wants me to tell you that the city of Darwin in Australia voted laksa the meal of choice for breakfast, lunch and dinner.
Oh, they even have it in ice cream and their beer, I think.
That's terrifying. Thank you for the masala. Yes, Mr. Wikipedia over here. Okay, well, yes. And moving on, something that you've brought to IvyPrep is tea culture.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Everyone
I know I
seems
brought
to be
some really nice
drinking
tea
cups
bags.
of tea. Tiffany even has a little bit of milk, so everyone's been putting a splash of milk in their tea now.
So honestly, before I went to the UK, I mean, besides our local tea, I don't really drink like English tea and stuff like that. But when I went to the UK, oh my God, I think I drink like 6 to 10 cups of tea every day. It's just so ingrained in the culture. Tea is such a big part. Like you have tea before you leave your house. After you come back, you have a cup of tea again. And then when you're relaxing, you have a cup of tea. Before you go to bed, you have a cup of tea as well. So it's like people love their tea. And do you know that apparently 165 million cups of tea is drank in the UK every day?
What's the population of the UK?
Oh my God. I might be embarrassed to answer the question.
We'll fact check it.
Is that 50 million? Maybe we'll ask our producers. But
I don't know. Yeah, That's a lot of. When I was there, there would just be tea bags just all over the house, right? I'd leave the living room for a minute and come back, and there'd be a used tea bag sitting in the sink. I feel like, where did that come from? My aunt was perennially walking around with one glass of water and a cup of tea. So I have to say, I do quite enjoy it.
You
I
enjoyed
can really
it.
get behind it.
I think everyone's catching on to it in IvyPrep.
Yeah, especially over here. You have to keep those tea bags coming, though. I think once we run out
I'll
of
keep
those,
sending them. Don't worry.
then it's language is something you wanted to talk about. A funny story. I feel as though something that one of our law consultants, loves to tell students and loves to tell me as though I would forget, and then she has to keep refreshing my memory, is when she was doing her Oxford interview for law, she was talking, I mean, she was a kid straight out of RI, nice, strong Singaporean accent. She was talking to this professor, and he had asked her a question, and she gave the answer. And then he went in his very British accent, no, you're all wrong, and then proceeded to give his answer, which was exactly the same thing. It just had a British accent. Just like he couldn't understand what she had said, and she was sitting there like, oh dear. Well, she ended up getting in, and, good for her.
I can relate to that.
You can?
I can, because, I met Gavin in the UK.
In fact, I remember I don't know if you remember this. You were here last December, and we had gone to Gluttons by the Bay across the road, and we had asked you, who was your best friend at uni, and you looked at us and said, Gavin. We all thought that was really cute.
Yes, I met Gavin in Warwick. We were classmates, and so Gavin, he's British. He's lived in the UK his whole life, and I remember we went on our first date. I speak English, come on, and he speaks English, but we couldn't understand each other. Can you imagine? He just couldn't understand my accent. And I was just so puzzled. I was like, what do you mean? Like, sometimes I have to repeat myself 3 times and he still doesn't get it. And it was the same the other way around. His British accent was quite thick for me to understand. So I was like, sometimes I go like, what? And after a while, I just gave up asking him to repeat.
Did it grow on you over time?
Definitely. And now, of course, my accent is a bit mixed up as well. So,
and with Gavin having lived in Singapore, is his accent a bit mixed as well? Or?
Definitely.
Well, that's interesting.
He definitely picked up Singlish.
He throws in some Singlish.
And sometimes I hear him calling his clients. I was like, wow, I didn't know you can speak so Singlish.
Before we continue, I would like to take a quick break to remind you to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us improve and to reach a wider audience to provide further insight into this arduous journey. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to email us at our email linked in the description below. We'd love to hear from you. Now that we sort of moved on from uni and you've studied there, you've been there for so many years now, how do you find culture?
In the UK?
Yeah. And I use that term very broadly, right?
Yeah. Do you want to be more specific?
Well, I guess, what are the sort of everyday things that you and your friends do over there? Things that are, may or may not be quintessentially British. I know that when I was there, something that I really enjoyed was pub culture, right?
Definitely.
Because, everywhere in Singapore is high tables and uncomfortable chairs. When sometimes all I want to do is take a book and read in a pub. And so I loved, because most pubs are like these sort of old buildings.
That's
with
right. When you go to the UK, you have to visit a pub.
Yeah.
And I think the pub is just such a big part of, the culture. And, you go with your mates to have beer, to have a drink. You hang out with your friends in a pub. You even, go to pubs with families over the weekends to have a good roast, pint of ale. So pubs are just so, an integral part of the culture. And I would say that there's just so many pubs, good pubs in the UK to explore.
Are there any sort of major differences you see between life in the UK and life in Singapore?
With what, culturally?
Yeah. Just in terms of your experience.
I'll say in one aspect, it could be more sort of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So, say generally the British, they are very polite, but also very, so for some of them, they can be indirect because they're so polite about things and they say things really nicely. And that means that sometimes you may not really know what they're trying to say to you because they could be indirect. Or if you upset someone, you wouldn't know that, right?
As opposed to Singapore, where there's like, "Kwa sini kwa," and then they just yell at you.
Yeah, compared to Singapore, we're so direct and we're just to the point. So that was something that I think Gavin, when he lived in Singapore, he really experienced that. So like the British will always start off with, like, "Oh, hello, like, how's your day? How are you doing?" Whereas Singaporeans will go straight to the point, like, "No, why are you calling? Like, what do you want to tell me?" So we're quite efficient and straight to the point. So I think that was one big cultural difference between the UK and Singapore.
And there's another big difference that I think we probably should address, because it's something that a lot of parents and students are concerned about, is that of safety. What are your thoughts on safety in the UK, especially for all those parents out there who, parents are concerned about the safety in the US and the UK, but given that you've lived there, you have a child over there, you certainly trust that the city of London for a family. What are your thoughts on parents sending their kids over?
Yeah, I would say that, definitely you can't compare to Singapore because, Singapore we have a low crime rate and generally it's so much safer. And I think that's something, we take for granted sometimes. Yeah. But I think when you get to other countries like the US, or at least for the UK, I can kind of share a bit more. You get to become much more aware of how to keep yourself safe and what are some of the things you should try to avoid doing. So you just get a bit smarter about that. So for example, like, you never chope seats with your bag because that's going to be gone in 1 minute. Yeah. Right? If it's outside, it's gone. Or something like going out at night. Maybe it's you just have to be a bit more careful. When I was, every time I'm out at night, and let's say walking home alone, I always kind of look out the streets where I'm going, and if there's someone walking towards me that looks a bit like, maybe he had a bit too much drinks.
He's crossed the road.
I will just move away to another street, just kind of to avoid any trouble. And then some of the stories I've also heard from friends is, if you carry like something very valuable, try not to show that off, because you're just inviting trouble for someone to kind of eye what you have. And even in the last few years, there have been cases where, like tourists were walking down the street, or even locals, right? And they were holding their mobile phones, like it's very usual for us to be looking at our phones or typing a message. And motorcyclists would just zoom past and quickly take your phones off your hands. So it's just kind of being more alert and aware of your surrounding. And you can definitely avoid some of these, hopefully, these incidences.
I think there are always going to be safety issues wherever you go. Singapore, yes, of course, is an exception to the norm in most cases, but it's really just a question of mitigating it and not putting yourself in harm's way, which I think people are going to get used to. Things are always going to happen to tourists, but I think once you live there and once you become more of a local, you get used to everything that's going on. You know when to hold your phone tighter, when to put it in your pocket. Yeah. Things just get a lot safer for you.
Yeah, and my advice would be if you do really run into any trouble or, there's a confrontation, I would say to always keep calm and just try to get out of it, not to confront, the other person if you get yourself in that situation.
Okay. So let's change tack over here. I've been thinking of a question to ask, and I guess if you were to go back in time and you are JC1, JC2 Serene again, would you still apply to Singapore or would you try and apply overseas?
I think if at that time I had more knowledge of my options, I think if I was given more guidance on, Singapore is not the only option and there are all these different places you can go to, and also how could I make it work? Is it through financially, is it an education loan? If someone had been there for me, I would probably think about going overseas, because I've had the best year of my life in the UK. So definitely I would probably apply overseas as well as Singapore and see what my options are.
Okay. And if you were to leave the audience with any parting words or any words of wisdom or advice, what would those be?
Wow, wise words.
Wise words. Yeah.
I'd say
We've heard so many over the years. Huh? Now it's their turn.
right. I'd say to kind of like really follow your heart and put more time into exploring options. I think that's something that I really did not do enough. But I'm still glad I was given a place in a university in Singapore. And I think, yeah, just kind of explore beyond the usual route that we're provided with as Singaporeans. And if you do get out there into a university in the US or UK, just really prepare yourself to be much more open to the culture, to meeting people, and just really make the best use of your time in a different environment and take the opportunity to gain skills you've not be able to in Singapore, life skills, communication, social skills, and yeah, so that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for your time today, Serene. It's been a real pleasure having you. And thank you, students and parents, for joining us today. See you next time. That's all for today's episode of Dear Applicants. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you found the content valuable and insightful. If you'd like to learn more about our guests or the topics we discussed, be sure to check out our show notes for links and further resources.